memories that were never mine, a theory that we've lived before. I discovered memories in my mind that weren't mine when I was 68 years old, living quietly in Araraquara, São Paulo, and this discovery would destroy everything I believed about my life with my husband, Osvaldo. It started when I found myself remembering conversations I never had, places I never visited, and people I never met. But these memories felt as real as my own experiences, my stubborn and methodical personality, which had helped me run our small accounting firm for 40 years, now drove me to investigate these strange occurrences that were consuming my thoughts daily. The memories belonged to a woman named Cordelia, and through them, I began to piece together a devastating truth about my marriage that had been hidden for decades. Osvaldo, my husband of 45 years, had been living a double life with Cordelia for over 30 years, maintaining 2 separate families and 2 separate identities across different cities in São Paulo state. The first small twist came when I realized these memories were reaching me through Cordelia's belongings that Osvaldo had unknowingly brought into our home, items that somehow triggered these vivid recollections of her experiences with my husband. The second small twist revealed that Cordelia had recently passed away from a prolonged illness, and in her final months, she had discovered the truth about Osvaldo's deception, just as I was beginning to uncover it through her memories. The first medium twist showed that my own daughter, Beatrice, now 42, had been secretly meeting with Cordelia's children for years, believing they were distant cousins, never knowing they were actually her half-siblings. The second medium twist uncovered that Osvaldo had been using our joint savings and business profits to support both families, leaving our retirement fund nearly depleted, while I believed we were financially secure. Over the course of 18 months, 5 major events unfolded: discovering the memory episodes, finding Cordelia's personal items hidden in our home, confronting the evidence of financial deception, meeting Cordelia's children face to face, and orchestrating my elaborate revenge plan. My internal conflict centered on whether to expose the truth and destroy both families, or find a way to seek justice while protecting the innocent people involved. Each family member had their own motivation. Beatrice sought to understand her mysterious new relatives. Osvaldo desperately tried to maintain his double life as both began to crumble. And Cordelia's children wanted answers about their father's true identity. The cultural traditions of São Paulo's interior, where family honor and community reputation hold immense importance, made my situation even more complex as I navigated the shame and social implications of my husband's betrayal. My revenge plan involved slowly exposing Osvaldo's deception to our entire social circle, our business clients, and both families simultaneously, but not before I secured financial compensation for both families through legal maneuvers he never saw coming. The obstacles I faced included Osvaldo's attempts to gasify me by claiming I was developing dementia, and his efforts to move assets beyond my reach when he suspected I was uncovering his secrets. The major revelation came when I discovered that the memory episodes weren't supernatural at all, but were triggered by a rare neurological condition that made me extremely sensitive to emotional residues left on personal objects, allowing me to experience fragments of Cordelia's memories through items she had touched during moments of intense emotion. My theory about having lived before transformed into understanding that some people can access emotional imprints left by others on objects, and this ability had given me the power to uncover a truth that would have otherwise remained buried forever, leading to my ultimate triumph over decades of deception and my successful reclaiming of both dignity and financial security for all the families involved. Chapter 1. The coffee cup slipped from my trembling fingers at precisely 9:37 in the morning, shattering against the ceramic tiles of my kitchen floor in Araraquara, but that wasn't what made me gasp and stumble backward against the counter. It was the vivid memory that crashed into my mind at that exact moment, a memory that wasn't mine. I was standing in a different kitchen, wearing a blue floral dress I'd never owned, stirring sugar into coffee for a man I'd never met. Except the man looked exactly like my husband Osvaldo, but 20 years younger. And he was calling me Cordelia while running his fingers through hair that wasn't the silver gray I'd worn for the past decade. The memory felt so real I could taste the bitter coffee, feel the morning sun streaming through unfamiliar windows, smell the faint scent of jasmine that had never grown in my garden. My name is Madalena Santos. I'm 68 years old, and I've lived in this same house on Rua das Flores for 45 years with my husband Osvaldo. We built our life here methodically, brick by brick, just like I approach everything in my life. When I set my mind to something, I don't let go until I understand it completely. That stubborn streak served me well when we started our small accounting firm, Santos & Associates, helping local businesses keep their books straight and their finances in order. But this morning, as I knelt on the floor picking up pieces of broken porcelain, my methodical mind couldn't process what had just happened. The memory had been so vivid, so complete, that for those few seconds I had genuinely believed I was someone else entirely. I could still feel the phantom weight of that blue dress, still hear the name Cordelia echoing in my ears like a song I'd never learned, but somehow knew by heart. I swept up the ceramic shards with mechanical precision, my hands moving automatically while my brain raced through possibilities. Had I been dreaming standing up? Was this some kind of early sign of dementia? Something I should discuss with Dr. Miranda at my next appointment. The rational part of me, the part that had balanced thousands of ledgers and caught countless mathematical errors over the decades, insisted this was just my imagination playing tricks. But the memory felt too real, too detailed, too emotionally charged to be a simple daydream. As I dumped the broken pieces into the trash, I noticed something strange. On the counter where I'd been standing, next to where I'd placed the coffee cup, sat a small wooden jewelry box I'd never seen before. The wood was old, but well maintained, with intricate carved roses along the edges and a tiny brass clasp that had aged to a dark patina. My breath caught in my throat because somehow, impossibly, I knew this box. Not from my own life, but from that flash of memory that had caused me to drop the cup. I reached for it with shaking fingers, and the moment my skin made contact with the smooth wood, another wave of memories crashed over me. I was sitting at a vanity table in a bedroom I'd never been in, carefully placing a pair of pearl earrings into this very box. But in the memory, the wood was newer, the brass brighter, and the woman looking back at me from the mirror had dark brown hair and green eyes, instead of my gray hair and brown eyes. The woman was beautiful in a way I'd never been, with high cheekbones and full lips, but when she smiled, it was with my husband's favorite dimpled expression that I'd seen him make 1,000 times. The memory ended as abruptly as it had begun, leaving me gasping and gripping the edge of the counter for support. This time, there was no denying what I'd experienced. These weren't random daydreams or early signs of cognitive decline. These were someone else's memories, complete with emotions and sensations that belonged to a woman named Cordelia, and Osvaldo was in every single one of them. I stumbled to our bedroom, clutching the jewelry box like a lifeline, my mind reeling with implications I wasn't ready to face. Our bedroom looked exactly as it always had, neat and organized, with Osvaldo's reading glasses on his nightstand, and my romance novels stacked beside my side of the bed. Everything was normal, familiar, unchanged, except for the growing collection of small items I was now noticing for the first time. A silk scarf draped over the back of our bedroom chair that I couldn't remember buying. A bottle of perfume on my dresser that I'd never opened but somehow knew smelled like gardenias. A small framed photograph tucked behind our wedding picture that showed a woman with dark hair standing beside a fountain I'd never seen, smiling at the camera with an expression of pure joy. My legs gave out, and I sank onto the edge of our bed, the jewelry box clutched tightly in my lap. How long had these items been here? How had I never noticed them before? Or had I seen them but never really looked, accepting their presence as part of the familiar landscape of my own home? I opened the jewelry box with trembling fingers, and the small tune it played was hauntingly familiar, though I'd never heard it before in my life. Inside, nestled in faded blue velvet, were pieces of jewelry that made my heart race with recognition. The pearl earrings from the memory, a delicate gold bracelet, and a wedding ring that was identical to mine, except for the inscription on the inside. With shaking hands, I removed the ring and held it up to the light streaming through our bedroom window. The inscription read, Para Cordelia, Meo Mor, et Tecno, Osvaldo. Dated exactly 3 years after Osvaldo and I had been married. The box slipped from my numb fingers, scattering jewelry across our bedroom floor as the devastating truth began to take shape in my mind. My husband of 45 years, the man who kissed me goodbye every morning and shared his dreams with me every night, had been living another life with another woman named Cordelia, and somehow, through objects that he'd brought into our home, I was experiencing her memories as if they were my own. I sat there surrounded by evidence of Osvaldo's betrayal. Pieces of another woman's life scattered across the floor of the bedroom where I'd slept beside him for decades, and tried to comprehend the magnitude of what I'd discovered. But this was only the beginning. As I reached for the scattered jewelry, my fingers brushed against the gold bracelet, and suddenly I was somewhere else entirely. I was in a restaurant I'd never been to, wearing clothes I'd never owned, listening to Osvaldo tell me he loved me while slipping this very bracelet onto my wrist. The date, according to the memory, was our anniversary. My anniversary with Osvaldo, except in this memory, we were celebrating 15 years together, not the 20 years we'd actually been married at that time. The memory faded, leaving me gasping on my bedroom floor. But the implications were crystal clear. This wasn't just an affair. This was a complete double life, with anniversaries and celebrations and memories that paralleled my own marriage. Osvaldo hadn't just betrayed me. He'd built an entire alternate existence with this woman named Cordelia. And now, through some inexplicable connection to her belongings, I was experiencing her life, her love, her joy with the man I'd thought belonged only to me. Chapter 2. 3 days passed before I could bring myself to touch anything else in the house. I moved through our home like a stranger, seeing everything with new eyes, wondering what other secrets were hiding in plain sight. Osvaldo noticed my distraction, of course. After 45 years of marriage, he could read my moods better than anyone. You seem tired, mi amor, he said over breakfast, reaching across our small kitchen table to squeeze my hand with the same gentle affection he'd shown me for decades. Maybe you should take a break from the office this week. I stared at his familiar face, trying to reconcile the loving husband sitting across from me with the man I'd seen in Cordelia's memories. His brown eyes showed genuine concern, the same eyes that had looked at me with love on our wedding day. The same eyes that had apparently looked at another woman with identical devotion for God knows how long. I'm fine, I managed to say, though nothing could have been further from the truth. Just didn't sleep well. He nodded understandingly and returned to his newspaper, the same morning routine we'd followed for years. He read me interesting headlines, while I finished my coffee, then kissed my cheek, before heading to the office we'd shared for 4 decades. Everything was normal, routine, unchanged. Except now, I knew it was all built on lies. After he left, I sat in our kitchen staring at my reflection in the coffee pot, trying to decide what to do next. My methodical nature demanded a systematic investigation. I needed to understand the scope of Osvaldo's deception before I could decide how to respond. But part of me was terrified of what else I might discover. I started in our bedroom, carefully, examining every item I couldn't clearly remember acquiring. The silk scarf triggered memories of a trip to Rio de Janeiro that I'd never taken, where Cordelia had bought it from a street vendor, while Osvaldo held her hand and whispered promises about their future together. The perfume brought flashes of intimate moments in hotel rooms I'd never seen, where Osvaldo had sprayed it on Cordelia's neck before they made love with a passion I hadn't experienced with him in years. Each memory was a knife to my heart, but I forced myself to continue. I needed to know everything. In Osvaldo's closet, tucked behind his winter coats, I found a small suitcase I'd never seen before. Inside were clothes that belonged to neither of us, women's clothing in sizes that would fit someone taller and thinner than me, packed as if for frequent travel. When I touched a yellow sundress, I was suddenly in a marketplace in Campinas, laughing as Osvaldo bought me flowers from a vendor who called us a beautiful couple. The memories were becoming easier to access, as if my brain was learning to tune into whatever frequency connected me to Cordelia's experiences. But they were also becoming more painful, showing me a version of my husband that I'd apparently never known. In Cordelia's memories, Osvaldo was spontaneous and romantic, taking weekend trips and buying surprise gifts. With me, he'd been steady and reliable, but never particularly adventurous. I found receipts hidden in the suitcase that painted a clear picture of Osvaldo's double life. Hotel bills from cities across São Paulo state, restaurant charges for romantic dinners, jewelry store purchases that had never made their way to me. The dates went back over 30 years, starting just 15 years into our marriage, when I thought we were at our happiest. My hands shook as I calculated the financial implications. These weren't occasional indiscretions. They represented a consistent drain on our resources that had been going on for decades. Money I thought we were saving for retirement had apparently been funding an entirely separate life. I was so absorbed in the receipts that I didn't hear the front door open. "Madalena?" "I forgot my reading glasses," Osvaldo called from the living room. Panic shot through me as I realized I was sitting on our bedroom floor surrounded by evidence of his betrayal. I quickly shoved everything back into the suitcase and pushed it into the closet. But there wasn't time to get up and pretend I'd been doing something else. "In here," I called, trying to keep my voice steady. He appeared in the doorway and stopped short when he saw me sitting on the floor beside his closet. For just a moment, something flickered across his face. Fear, guilt, but it passed so quickly I might have imagined it. "What are you doing down there, Quarita?" "I dropped an earring," I lied, gesturing vaguely at the floor. "Thought it might have rolled under here." He helped me to my feet, with the same gentle care he'd always shown, and I had to bite my tongue to keep from screaming at him. How could he touch me so tenderly when he'd been touching another woman for 30 years? How could he look at me with such apparent love when he'd been building an entirely separate life behind my back? "Did you find it?" he asked, scanning the floor. "No, it must be somewhere else," I said, amazed at how normal my voice sounded. He retrieved his glasses from the nightstand and kissed my cheek before leaving again. I stood there after the front door closed, touching the spot where his lips had brushed my skin, feeling like everything I'd believed about my life was crumbling around me. That afternoon, I called our daughter Beatrice from the office. "Mama, what a nice surprise," she said, her voice warm with affection. At 42, Beatrice had inherited my stubborn streak and Osvaldo's easy charm. She worked as a teacher in nearby Snow, Carlos, and called us every Sunday without fail. "Is everything okay?" "I wanted to ask you something," I began carefully. "Have you ever met any distant relatives from your father's side that I might not know about?" There was a long pause. "Why do you ask?" "Just curious. You know how your father is about his family history. Sometimes I wonder if there are cousins or relatives we've lost touch with." Another pause, longer this time. "Actually, Mama, there are some people I've been meaning to tell you about. I met them at a conference last year, and we've become quite close. They have the same last name as Papa, and we think we might be related somehow." My heart started racing. "What are their names?" "Geronimo and Eduarda Santos. They're both around my age, and they live in Campinas. Geronimo is an engineer. and Eduarda teaches nursing. They're wonderful people, Mama. I was thinking maybe we could all have dinner sometime. Try to figure out how we're connected to Papa's family. Campinas, the same city from Cordelia's memory of the marketplace. The same city that appeared on several of the hotel receipts I'd found. That sounds lovely, I managed to say. Maybe soon. After I hung up, I sat in my office chair staring at the family photo on my desk. Osvaldo, Beatrice, and me at our graduation, all smiling happily. A perfect family picture that apparently represented only half of my husband's life. I spent the rest of the afternoon trying to focus on work, but my mind kept racing with questions. If Geronimo and Eduarda were around Beatrice's age and had the same last name, could they be Osvaldo's children with Cordelia? Had my daughter been unknowingly building relationships with her half-siblings? When I got home that evening, I went straight to our computer and searched for Cordelia Santos in Campinas. What I found made my blood run cold. The obituary was dated 6 months ago. Cordelia Maria Santos, beloved mother of Geronimo and Eduarda Santos, passed away peacefully after a courageous battle with cancer. She was preceded in death by her longtime companion, who she preferred to keep private. Services were held at it. I stared at the screen, trying to process what I was reading. Cordelia was dead. Had been dead for 6 months, which meant that the memories I'd been experiencing were from a woman who was no longer alive, somehow preserved in her belongings, like emotional fingerprints. But there was something else in the obituary that made my stomach lurch. The phrase, longtime companion, who she preferred to keep private, suggested that even in death, Cordelia had protected Osvaldo's secret. She'd maintained his double life right up until the end. I printed the obituary and sat staring at the small black and white photograph that accompanied it. Cordelia had been beautiful, just as I'd seen in the memories, with the kind of elegant features that photographed well. She looked happy in the picture, smiling with genuine joy. This was the woman my husband had loved for 30 years. This was the mother of my daughter's new friends. This was the woman whose memories were now somehow living in my head, showing me a version of my marriage that I'd never known existed. As I sat there holding her obituary, one more devastating thought occurred to me. If Cordelia had died 6 months ago, that meant all of her belongings had to go somewhere, and if some of them had ended up in my house, hidden among my possessions, then Osvaldo must have been the one to bring them here. My husband hadn't just been living a double life for 30 years. He'd been grieving another woman's death for the past 6 months. Right under my nose, while I remained completely oblivious to his pain. Chapter 3. The next morning, I woke up before dawn with a plan forming in my mind. If I was going to understand the full scope of Osvaldo's deception, I needed to approach this systematically, the same way I'd approach auditing a client's books when the numbers didn't add up. I needed facts, documentation, and irrefutable evidence. But first, I needed to understand exactly how these memories worked. I waited until Osvaldo left for his morning jog, a routine he'd maintained for 20 years. Then went to retrieve the jewelry box from our bedroom. This time, instead of letting the memories overwhelm me, I tried to approach them analytically. I sat on our bed and opened the box, focusing on the pearl earrings. The memory came immediately, but now I was prepared for it. I found myself in Cordelia's bedroom, getting ready for what felt like an important dinner. She was nervous. I could feel it in the flutter of her stomach, the way her hands trembled slightly as she fastened the earrings. In the mirror's reflection, I could see Osvaldo lying on the bed behind her, fully dressed in a suit I recognized, watching her with an expression of absolute adoration. "You look perfect," he said in the memory, and I felt Cordelia's heart skip with joy at his words. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, turning to face him. "Meeting your business partners. Wife feels so... She love you," Osvaldo assured her, getting up to wrap his arms around her. Madalena is wonderful. She has no reason to suspect anything, and this dinner will help maintain our cover. The memories shattered like glass, leaving me gasping on my bed as the full implications hit me. I remembered that dinner. It had been 5 years ago, when we'd invited some potential clients to our home for a business dinner. Osvaldo had brought a woman he'd introduced as a friend of a friend who was new to the area and didn't know anyone. I'd spent the entire evening being kind to her, making sure she felt included, even complimenting her pearl earrings. I had welcomed my husband's mistress into my home and treated her like an honored guest. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. Not only had Osvaldo been deceiving me for decades, but he'd actually brought Cordelia to our house, sat her at our dinner table, and let me serve her food while she wore the jewelry he'd bought her with money from our joint accounts. I stumbled to the bathroom and threw up, my body rejecting the magnitude of the betrayal as much as my mind was struggling to process it. When I looked at myself in the mirror afterward, I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. In just a few days, I'd aged years. My face was pale and drawn, my eyes hollow with the weight of terrible knowledge. But I wasn't done. I needed to know everything. I spent the morning systematically going through our house, touching objects. I couldn't clearly remember acquiring and allowing the memories to flood through me. A decorative vase in our living room showed me Christmas morning in an apartment I'd never seen, where Cordelia opened it as a gift from Osvaldo, while 2 young adults watched from the sofa. The young man looked remarkably like Osvaldo at that age, and the young woman had Beatrice's smile. A cookbook in our kitchen triggered memories of Cordelia, preparing elaborate meals for family gatherings that I'd never been invited to. Celebrations where Osvaldo played the role of devoted father to Geronimo and Eduarda, while I spent the same holidays believing he was visiting his elderly aunt in Ribera, Preto. Each memory was another piece of a puzzle that painted a picture of betrayal so complete, so thoroughly planned, that it took my breath away. This wasn't just an affair. It was a deliberately constructed parallel life that had been maintained with surgical precision for over 30 years. By noon, I was emotionally exhausted, but determined to continue. I called Beatrice from our landline, making sure to use the house phone so there would be a record of the call. "Mama, twice in 2 days. You're spoiling me," she said with a laugh. "I've been thinking about those relatives you mentioned," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "Geronimo and Eduarda. I'd love to meet them. Maybe you could arrange something." "Really? That's wonderful. I was hoping you'd say that. Actually, they've been wanting to meet you and Papa too. They said their mother used to talk about wanting to meet the rest of the Santos family, but she was always too shy to reach out." My grip tightened on the phone. Even from beyond the grave, Cordelia was being painted as the innocent party, too shy to cause trouble. What did their mother do for work? She was a seamstress, I think. Very talented, according to them. She made beautiful clothes and did alterations for some of the nicer shops in Campinas. Geronimo said she always dreamed of opening her own boutique, but life got in the way. A seamstress. That explained the beautiful clothes I'd found in the hidden suitcase. The elegant dresses that had triggered memories of Cordelia wearing them to dinner dates and romantic weekends with my husband. "What about their father?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "That's the sad part, Mama. They never knew him well. He traveled a lot for work, and their mother was very private about their relationship. Geronimo said he'd visit regularly when they were growing up, but he was never around for long. They think he might have passed away, because the visits stopped a few years ago." The visits stopped a few years ago, right around the time Osvaldo started complaining about back problems. That made long drives difficult. The same time he'd reduced his supposed visits to his aunt in Ribera. "I see," I managed to say. "Well, I'd still love to meet them. Why don't you arrange dinner for this weekend?" "I'll call them right now. Mama, this is so exciting. I have a feeling we're all going to get along wonderfully." After I hung up, I sat in our quiet house trying to imagine how that dinner would go. Would I be able to look at Geronimo and Eduarda without seeing Osvaldo's features reflected in their faces? Would I be able to sit across from them, knowing they were my daughter's half-siblings, created during a relationship that had stolen 30 years of my life? That afternoon, I did something I'd never done in 45 years of marriage. I went through Osvaldo's personal papers without permission. His desk in our home office was usually off-limits, a boundary I'd respected out of habit more than any formal agreement. But nothing about our relationship was what I believed it to be, so I saw no reason to honor old rules that had been based on lies. What I found was a masterpiece of deception. There were 2 sets of everything, 2 appointment calendars, with different schedules carefully maintained in different handwriting, 2 address books, one containing our friends and business contacts, another filled with names I didn't recognize, 2 sets of financial records, showing our legitimate business expenses alongside a parallel accounting system that tracked money being funneled to accounts I'd never heard of. The level of organization was staggering. Osvaldo had been running his double life like a business, with systems and procedures and backup plans. There were even 2 different cell phones hidden in his desk drawer, one that I knew about, and another that contained text messages and photos that made my hands shake with rage. Photos of Cordelia in the same dresses I'd found in the hidden suitcase. Photos of family gatherings with Geronimo and Eduarda. Photos of birthday parties and graduations and holidays, all featuring my husband as a proud father and devoted companion to a family I'd never known existed. But the worst discovery was a folder labeled insurance policies that contained documents I'd never seen before. Osvaldo had taken out a life insurance policy on himself 5 years ago, with Cordelia listed as the primary beneficiary and Geronimo and Eduarda as secondary beneficiaries. I wasn't mentioned anywhere on the documents. My husband had been preparing to leave me everything except his life insurance, which would have gone to his secret family upon his death. Even in planning for his eventual passing, he'd been ensuring that Cordelia and her children would be taken care of, while I would be left with whatever remained of our business and savings accounts, amounts that were clearly diminished by decades of supporting 2 households. I was still staring at the insurance documents when I heard Osvaldo's key in the front door. I quickly shoved everything back into his desk and rushed to the kitchen, trying to look busy preparing dinner. "Madalena, you're home early," he called. "Slow day at the office," I replied, focusing intently on chopping vegetables for soup. He came into the kitchen and wrapped his arms around me from behind. The same affectionate gesture he'd made thousands of times before, but now I could feel the deception in his touch, the practiced nature of his tenderness. "Beatrice called," he said, his voice carefully casual. "She said you want to meet those relatives she mentioned." I tensed in his arms. Yes, I thought it would be nice. We don't have much family, and if they're truly related, of course. "Me all more. Family is important." His voice was steady, but I could feel a subtle change in his grip, a tension that hadn't been there moments before. "She's arranging dinner for Saturday," I continued, watching his reflection in the kitchen window. "I'm looking forward to finally meeting Geronimo and Eduarda." For just a moment, his entire body went rigid against mine. Then he forced himself to relax and pressed a kiss to my neck. "That sounds wonderful," he said, but his voice had gone slightly hoarse. As I stood there, in his embrace, vegetables forgotten on the cutting board, I realized that Osvaldo knew exactly who Geronimo and Eduarda were. He'd been dreading this moment, probably for months since Cordelia's death, knowing that eventually the 2 halves of his life would collide. But what he didn't know was that I already understood the truth. What he couldn't have imagined was that his secret had been revealed through the impossible medium of his dead lover's memories, preserved in objects he'd brought into our home during his grief. Saturday's dinner was going to be interesting indeed. Chapter 4. Saturday arrived, with the kind of oppressive heat that settles over São Paulo's interior in late summer, making the air thick and hard to breathe. I spent the morning preparing our house for what might be the most important dinner of my life, polishing surfaces that were already clean and rearranging flowers that didn't need rearranging. Osvaldo had been unusually quiet all week, his normal easy conversation replaced by distracted silences and nervous energy. "Do you need help with anything?" he asked for the third time that morning, hovering in the kitchen doorway while I prepared the dessert. "I'm fine," I assured him, the same response I'd given each time. But fine was the last thing I was. My hands trembled as I worked, and I'd already dropped a mixing bowl and burned the first batch of cookies I'd attempted to make. By 6 o'clock, everything was ready. Our dining room table was set with our best dishes, the ones we'd received as wedding gifts 45 years ago. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was using our wedding china to serve dinner to my husband's secret children. Beatrice arrived first, carrying a bouquet of yellow roses and wearing the bright smile that had always been her trademark. "Mama, you look beautiful," she said, kissing my cheek. "But are you feeling all right? You seem a bit pale." "Just tired," I lied, accepting the flowers and trying to match her cheerful energy. Osvaldo emerged from our bedroom wearing his best suit, the same one he'd worn to important business dinners for years. He looked handsome and distinguished, every bit the successful businessman he'd worked so hard to become. But now I knew that this carefully cultivated image was just another layer of deception. "Papa looks nervous," Beatrice observed with a laugh. "It's just dinner with family, not a business meeting." If only she knew how close to the truth she was. The doorbell rang at exactly 7 o'clock, and I felt my heart start racing as Osvaldo went to answer it. I heard voices in the foyer, pleasant exchanges and introductions, but the words seemed to come from very far away. Beatrice squeezed my hand supportively, misinterpreting my anxiety as simple nervousness about meeting new relatives. Then they walked into our living room, and I had to grip the back of a chair to keep from falling down. Geronimo was unmistakably Osvaldo's son. He had the same dark eyes, the same strong jaw, the same way of holding his shoulders when he was trying to make a good impression. At 38, he looked exactly like Osvaldo had when we were first married. So much so that it was like seeing my husband through a time machine. Eduarda was more subtle, but the resemblances were there if you knew what to look for. She had Osvaldo's nose, and the same way of tilting her head when she listened. At 40, she was graceful and poised, with an intelligence in her eyes that reminded me powerfully of Beatrice at that age. "Tia Madalena," Geronimo said warmly, stepping forward to embrace me. "It's such a pleasure to finally meet you. Beatrice has told us so many wonderful things about you and Tio Osvaldo." The casualness with which he called my husband uncle was like a knife to my heart, but I managed to smile and return his embrace. When Eduarda hugged me, I caught a faint scent of the same perfume I'd found on my dresser, the one that smelled like gardenias. "We brought you something," Eduarda said shyly, holding out a small wrapped package. "It's nothing much, just something we thought you might like." I unwrapped it with trembling fingers and found a framed photograph of a young woman I recognized immediately, even though I'd never seen this particular picture before. It was Cordelia, probably in her 20s, wearing a white sundress and laughing at the camera with pure joy. "That's our mother," Geronimo explained. "We thought you might want to see what she looked like. Beatrice mentioned you were interested in family history, and Mama always said we probably had relatives we'd never met." I stared at the photograph, seeing Cordelia's face clearly for the first time outside of memories and newspaper obituaries. She'd been beautiful, but more than that, she'd been radiant with happiness. This was a woman who'd been deeply loved, cherished, protected. "She's lovely," I managed to say, though the words felt like glass in my throat. "She was," Eduarda agreed softly. "She passed away 6 months ago, but she always talked about wanting to find more family connections. I think she would have loved meeting you. Over dinner, the conversation flowed easily, guided by Beatrice's natural warmth and the genuine affection that had already developed between her and her half-siblings. They shared stories about their work, their hopes for the future, their memories of growing up in Campinas. Throughout it all, Osvaldo sat quietly at the head of our table, responding when spoken to but clearly struggling with the situation. I watched him carefully, noting every micro-expression, every tell that 45 years of marriage had taught me to recognize. He was proud of Geronimo and Eduarda. I could see it in the way his eyes lit up when they talked about their accomplishments. But he was also terrified, constantly glancing between them and me, as if waiting for the moment when his carefully constructed world would collapse. Tio Osvaldo, Geronimo said during the main course, Mama used to say we had the same eyes, as someone she once knew. Looking at you now, I think she meant you. There's definitely a family resemblance. The fork in Osvaldo's hand trembled slightly, but his voice remained steady. Many people in our family have similar features. It's not unusual. She never told us much about our father, Eduarda added quietly. She said, he was a good man, who loved us very much, but that circumstances kept them apart. We always hoped we might find him someday, or at least learn more about his family. The silence that followed was deafening. I could see Beatrice looking between our father and these two young people who bore such strong resemblances to him. Her mind clearly working to process connections she wasn't quite ready to acknowledge. Perhaps he had reasons for staying away, I said carefully, my voice somehow remaining calm despite the storm raging inside me. Sometimes people make choices that seem impossible to understand from the outside. Geronimo nodded thoughtfully. Mama always said that love sometimes requires sacrifice. She never seemed bitter about it, just sad, sometimes. Especially toward the end. The end? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. The last few months of her illness, Eduarda explained. She became very focused on making sure we had connections beyond just each other. That's why she encouraged us to reach out to distant relatives, to build the family network she felt we'd missed growing up. So even dying, Cordelia had been orchestrating connections that would eventually expose Osvaldo's secret. I wondered if she'd planned it this way, if her final act had been to ensure that the truth would eventually come to light. After dinner, while Beatrice and Eduarda looked through photo albums in the living room, Geronimo approached me in the kitchen, where I was preparing coffee. Tia, Madalena, he said quietly, I wanted to thank you for welcoming us into your home. After Mama died, Eduarda and I felt very alone in the world. Finding family, even distant relatives, has meant everything to us. I turned to look at him, seeing Osvaldo's earnest expression on this young man's face, and felt my heart breaking for all of us. These weren't just my husband's secret children. They were genuinely good people who'd been denied a real relationship with their father their entire lives. Family is important, I agreed, echoing Osvaldo's words from earlier in the week. Even when it's complicated, something in my tone made him look at me more closely. Is everything all right, Tia? You seem troubled tonight. Before I could answer, Osvaldo appeared in the kitchen doorway. The coffee smells wonderful. Meu amor, he said, but his eyes were fixed on Geronimo, with an intensity that made the air in the room feel electric. For a moment, father and son stood facing each other in my kitchen, the truth hanging between them like a live wire. Geronimo's eyes widened slightly as he took in Osvaldo's features up close, probably seeing the same unmistakable resemblances that had been obvious to me from the moment he'd walked through our door. I should help Eduarda with the photo albums, Geronimo said finally, his voice strangely hoarse. After he left, Osvaldo and I stood alone in our kitchen, the weight of 30 years of deception pressing down on us like a physical force. Madalena, he began, but I held up my hand to stop him. Not now, I said quietly. Not with them here. He nodded, understanding that whatever reckoning was coming would have to wait until we were alone with our shattered marriage and all the lies that had held it together for so long. The rest of the evening passed in a strange, suspended reality. We served coffee and dessert, looked at more photographs, made plans for future get-togethers that I knew would never happen. Beatrice was delighted with her new relatives, already making plans to introduce them to her fiancé and incorporate them into her upcoming wedding plans. When it came time for them to leave, Geronimo and Eduarda hugged us both with genuine warmth, thanking us repeatedly for our hospitality and expressing their joy at finding family connections they'd never expected. "We'd love to have you visit us in Campinas sometime," Eduarda said as they prepared to go. "We could show you where Mama lived, maybe visit some of the places she loved." "That would be wonderful," Beatrice said before I could respond. A real family reunion. After they left and Beatrice had gone home to her own apartment, Osvaldo and I were finally alone with the truth that could no longer be denied or hidden. He sat heavily in his favorite chair, looking every one of his 70 years, and buried his face in his hands. "How long have you known?" he asked, without looking up. Chapter 5, 3 days, I replied finally, my voice sounding stronger than I had expected. 3 days since I found the first piece of the puzzle you constructed so carefully over 30 years. Osvaldo lifted his face from his hands, his eyes red and filled with pain that I could no longer distinguish, whether it was genuine remorse or simply the desperation of being discovered. The silence between us stretched like an abyss, filled only by the tick-tock of the wall clock my father had given me as a wedding gift so many years ago. "Her memories," I continued, watching every micro-expression on his familiar face that now seemed like that of a stranger. "They come through the objects you brought into our house, the jewelry box, the silk scarf, the gardenia perfume. Every time I touch something that belonged to Cordelia, I live moments from her life, moments with you." He remained motionless for so long that I thought perhaps he hadn't heard me. Then, slowly, a tear ran down his aged face. "That's impossible," he murmured, but his voice carried more amazement than disbelief. "I thought so too," I said, sitting in the chair across from him, maintaining a physical distance that reflected the emotional abyss now opening between us. But impossible or not, it happened. And through those memories, I discovered that our entire life was built on a lie. The days that followed were a strange dance of avoidance and confrontation. Osvaldo tried to maintain his normal routines, waking at the same time, drinking coffee the same way, reading the newspaper with the same apparent concentration. But I now watched him with new eyes, noticing the small signs I had ignored for decades, the way he checked his phone when he thought I wasn't looking, the whispered phone calls he said were about business, the sudden trips that always had plausible explanations. During this tense period, I began investigating more systematically. My methodical nature, which had always served me well in business, now turned to dissecting the details of the betrayal that had shaped my adult life. I created secret spreadsheets, organizing dates, locations, and expenses. Each receipt I found was a new piece of the puzzle. Each discovered photo was another wound in my already torn heart. It was during one of these investigation sessions that I made a discovery that would change everything. Hidden in a sealed envelope at the bottom of Osvaldo's drawer, I found documents revealing the existence of a second bank account. An account he had maintained for 15 years under the name of a shell company. The statements showed regular deposits and substantial withdrawals, a parallel money flow that represented a considerable fortune. When I confronted Osvaldo with this discovery that afternoon, his reaction was not what I expected. Instead of denial or excuses, he simply collapsed into his chair like a man whose last defenses had finally crumbled. "I was going to tell you," he said weakly. "After Cordelia died, I knew I couldn't keep this up much longer." "Tell me what, exactly?" I demanded, my voice sharp with controlled fury. that you've been stealing from our business to support another family, that you've been living two completely separate lives for 30 years, that our daughter has been unknowingly building relationships with her half-siblings. Each accusation hit him like a physical blow, and I felt a dark satisfaction watching him shrink under the weight of his own actions. It wasn't supposed to happen this way, he whispered. I met Cordelia at a business conference in Campinas. She was working as a seamstress for one of the hotels, alterations for the guests. She was so beautiful, so full of life. I told myself it was just a brief attraction, something that would pass. But it didn't pass, I stated. Not a question but an acknowledgement of obvious fact. No, it didn't. When I tried to end it after a few months, she told me she was pregnant with Geronimo. His voice broke on his son's name. I couldn't abandon her, Madalena. She had no one else. So you chose to abandon me instead, emotionally, if not physically. I never stopped loving you, he protested, reaching toward me with trembling hands that I pulled away from. You have to believe that. Everything I did, every lie I told, was to protect you from this pain. Protect me. The laugh that escaped me was bitter and harsh. By stealing our retirement savings, by bringing your mistress to our dinner table, by letting me treat her like an honored guest while she wore jewelry you bought her with our money. The color drained from his face. You remember that dinner. I remember everything now, Osvaldo, through her memories. I've lived your entire relationship. I've felt her joy when you told her you loved her, her excitement when you took her on trips I never knew you were taking, her pain when she realized she was dying and you couldn't even acknowledge her publicly. He buried his face in his hands, again, his shoulders shaking with sobs that might have moved me once, but now only filled me with cold determination. There's more, isn't there? I pressed. The insurance policy with her as beneficiary, the apartment you rented for them, the college funds for Geronimo and Eduarda. How much of our life together was subsidizing your other family? About 40%, he admitted in a voice so quiet I had to strain to hear him. Over the years, I diverted about 40% of our income to support them. The number hit me like a physical blow. 40%. For 30 years, nearly half of everything we had earned had gone to support his secret family, while I believed we were building security for our own future together. And now, I asked, now that Cordelia is gone and your children are adults, what was your plan? To finally tell me the truth and ask for forgiveness. I don't. No, he said honestly. I've been paralyzed since she died. I brought some of her things here because I couldn't bear to throw them away, but I couldn't keep them at the office where someone might ask questions. I never imagined. He trailed off, looking at me with something that might have been fear, that I would somehow access her memories through them. I finished. Yes, that part is rather unexpected, isn't it? That night, I lay awake in our bed listening to Osvaldo's fitful breathing beside me and planning my next moves. The revelation about the hidden account had given me an idea, a way to ensure that justice was served, not just emotionally, but financially. If he had been systematically stealing from our partnership to support his other family, then there were legal remedies available to me. But more than legal justice, I wanted something deeper. I wanted him to experience the same kind of devastation that I was feeling, the complete upending of everything he thought he could count on. Over the next week, I began laying the groundwork for what I was starting to think of as my strategic response. I photocopied every document I had found, created detailed records of the financial discrepancies, and began researching my legal options. But I also did something else. I started reaching out to people in our social circle, our business community, our church congregation. I didn't tell them the truth, not yet. Instead, I began planting seeds of a different story entirely. I'm so worried about Osvaldo, I confided to Maria Santos, the president of our Church Ladies Auxiliary, during our regular Tuesday coffee meeting. He's been so secretive lately, making mysterious phone calls, and disappearing for hours without explanation. I'm starting to wonder if he's having some kind of mental health crisis. Oh my, Maria replied, her eyes wide with concern, and just a hint of the gossip-hungry gleam that made her such an effective communicator in our community. Have you thought about getting him some professional help? I've been considering it, I said sadly. But you know how proud he is. He would never admit to having problems. Similar conversations took place with our accountant's wife, the owner of our favorite restaurant, and several prominent clients of our firm. In each case, I painted a picture of a man whose behavior had become increasingly erratic and concerning. A devoted wife worried about her husband's mental state. Meanwhile, at home, Osvaldo seemed to be aging years each day. The weight of his exposed secret was crushing him, and his attempts to return to normal routines only made the tension between us more obvious. He would start to reach for me during our evening television watching, then pull back when he saw my expression. He would begin to speak about mundane daily matters, then trail off when he encountered my cold politeness. "Madalena," he said one morning over breakfast, "we need to talk about what happens next." "Next?" I asked, not looking up from my toast. "I know you'll never forgive me. I know our marriage is over, but we need to figure out the practical matters. The business, the house, how to handle Beatrice finding out the truth." I set down my coffee cup with deliberate care. "Do we, Osvaldo? Do we need to figure that out right now?" Something in my tone made him look at me more closely. "What do you mean?" "I mean that you've had 30 years to plan how to manage your double life. Surely you can give me a few weeks to decide how I want to handle its collapse." That afternoon, I made an appointment with Dr. Miranda, ostensibly for a routine checkup, but actually to discuss the memory episodes I had been experiencing. I needed to understand the neurological aspect of what was happening to me, both for my own peace of mind and because I suspected it might be important later. "These episodes you're describing," Dr. Miranda said thoughtfully, "they're quite unusual. The medical literature does contain some references to heightened emotional sensitivity in certain individuals, particularly those who have experienced significant trauma or stress." "Emotional sensitivity to what?" I asked. "There's a theory that intense emotions can leave what we might call imprints on objects that were present during highly charged emotional moments. Most people aren't sensitive to these imprints, but in rare cases, particularly when someone is under extreme psychological stress, they might become receptive to these emotional residues. So I'm not having a mental breakdown, not at all. In fact, your ability to access these memories suggests that you have a particularly developed sense of emotional intelligence and empathy. The stress of your current situation may have heightened your natural sensitivity to an extraordinary degree." Dr. Miranda's explanation gave me the final piece I needed for my plan. That evening, I called Beatrice and asked her to come over for dinner the following Sunday. I also called Geronimo and Eduarda directly, getting their numbers from Beatrice, and invited them as well. Another family dinner so soon? Osvaldo asked nervously when I told him about the invitations. "I thought it would be nice to continue building those family connections," I replied innocently. "After all, family is so important, don't you think?" The terror in his eyes told me that he was beginning to understand that I wasn't simply the devastated victim he had expected me to be. Chapter 6. Sunday arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that sometimes follows summer storms in Snow Paolo's interior, and I spent the morning preparing for what I knew would be the most important performance of my life. Every dish I chose had significance. Every detail of the table setting was calculated to support the narrative I was about to construct. Beatrice arrived first, as always punctual in bringing flowers from her garden. She seemed lighter today, happier, still glowing from the excitement of discovering new family members who had embraced her so warmly. "Mama, you seem different," she observed as we arranged the flowers in a vase. "More energetic, I suppose. I was worried about you last week. You seemed so tired and stressed." I've been doing a lot of thinking lately, I replied truthfully. Sometimes clarity comes when you least expect it. Geronimo and Eduarda arrived together, both carrying small gifts and wearing the slightly nervous expressions of people still getting comfortable with new family relationships. Looking at them now, knowing what I knew, the resemblances to Osvaldo were almost overwhelming. How had Beatrice not noticed? How had I myself missed it during that first dinner? Tia Madalena, Eduarda said, embracing me with genuine warmth. Thank you for inviting us again. We brought some photo albums we thought you might like to see. Pictures of Mama when she was younger. Perfect. How thoughtful of you, dear. I'm very interested in learning more about Cordelia. Osvaldo, who had been hovering nervously in the living room, went completely white when he heard me say his deceased lover's name so casually. I met his eyes across the room and smiled with what I hoped looked like innocent enthusiasm for research. During the early part of dinner, I guided the conversation carefully, asking questions about Cordelia's life that I already knew the answers to through her memories, but which would be revelatory to everyone else at the table. Tell me about your mother's work, I said to Geronimo. Beatrice mentioned she was a seamstress. Yes, she was incredibly talented, he replied proudly. She worked for several high-end hotels in Campinas, doing alterations and custom work for guests. She always said she learned something from every client, that each person brought their own story into her workroom. How interesting. Did she ever mention meeting anyone particularly memorable? Business connections, perhaps, or people who became friends. Eduarda and Geronimo exchanged a glance, and I could see them debating internally how much to share. There was someone, Eduarda said finally, a businessman she met early in her career, who became important to her. She never told us much about him, but we know he was the great love of her life. Really? Beatrice leaned forward with interest. How romantic. What happened to him? Circumstances kept them apart, Geronimo replied diplomatically. Mama always said that sometimes love requires sacrifice, and that the best way to love someone is to protect them from difficult choices. Across the table, Osvaldo was gripping his wine glass so tightly, I was surprised it didn't shatter. His face had gone from white to gray, and a thin sheen of perspiration had appeared on his forehead despite the comfortable temperature in our dining room. Papa, are you feeling all right? Beatrice asked with concern. You look unwell. Just a headache, he mumbled. Perhaps I should excuse myself. Nonsense, I said brightly. We're just getting to the interesting part. Please, continue telling us about your mother's friend. For the next hour, I orchestrated a conversation that slowly revealed the truth to everyone at the table, except the one person who already knew. It through carefully directed questions and innocent observations about family resemblances. I watched as understanding dawned first in Beatrice's eyes, then in Geronimo's and Eduarda's. The moment of complete recognition came when I brought out the photo albums Eduarda had shared, spreading them across our coffee table alongside our own family photos. Look at this, I said, positioning a picture of young Geronimo next to one of Osvaldo at the same age. The resemblance is remarkable. You could be father and son. The silence that followed was deafening. Beatrice stared at the photographs, then looked at her father, then back at the photographs. Geronimo and Eduarda were studying Osvaldo with new eyes, seeing in his features the answer to questions that had haunted them their entire lives. Tio Osvaldo, Geronimo said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper, is there something you need to tell us? Before Osvaldo could respond, I stood up with the practiced grace I'd cultivated over decades of hosting business dinners. Actually, I said, my voice carrying clearly through our suddenly silent dining room, I think it's time I told you all a story about memories that weren't mine, and the extraordinary way truth sometimes reveals itself. I spent the next 20 minutes explaining everything. The mysterious memory episodes that had started 3 days after that first coffee cup incident. The discovery of Cordelia's belongings hidden throughout our house. The slow revelation of a parallel life that had existed alongside our family for 30 years. I told them about the jewelry box and the wedding ring with its devastating inscription. I described finding the hidden bank accounts and insurance policies. I explained Dr. Miranda's theory about emotional imprints on objects and my unusual sensitivity to them. Throughout my narration, Osvaldo sat frozen in his chair, unable to deny the evidence I was presenting but equally unable to find words to defend himself. Beatrice, Geronimo, and Eduarda listened with expressions of growing shock and understanding. So you see, I concluded, returning to my seat with the composed demeanor I'd maintained throughout, what we have here isn't really a happy family reunion. It's the collision of two separate families that have been living parallel lives, supported by lies and maintained through deception. The aftermath was explosive and heartbreaking. Beatrice turned to her father with tears streaming down her face, her voice shaking with betrayal. How could you do this to Mama? How could you lie to all of us for so long? Geronimo and Eduarda were grappling with the revelation that their absent father hadn't been a tragic figure kept away by circumstances, but a man who had chosen to compartmentalize his life, giving them only the portions he could manage without disrupting his primary family. We have siblings, Eduarda whispered, looking at Beatrice with wonder and pain intermingled. We've been siblings all along, and we never knew. But it was Geronimo's reaction that cut deepest. Looking at Osvaldo with eyes that held 30 years of accumulated questions and disappointments, he said, every birthday, every graduation, every important moment of our lives, you chose not to be there. Not because you couldn't, but because it would have been inconvenient for your real family. That's not true, Osvaldo protested weakly. I loved you. I loved all of you. I was trying to protect everyone. By lying to everyone, Beatrice shot back. By stealing from Mama and our business to support your other life. By letting us all believe in a version of reality that never existed. The confrontation continued for another hour, with accusations and explanations flying back and forth across our dining room table. Through it all, I remained calm and composed, the eye of the hurricane I had deliberately created. Finally, when the initial explosion of emotions had exhausted itself, I stood up again. I think, I said quietly, that we all need time to process what's been revealed here tonight. But before anyone leaves, there are some practical matters we need to discuss. I walked to our hall closet and retrieved a manila envelope I had prepared earlier. From it, I pulled out copies of legal documents I had been preparing over the past week with the help of a lawyer Osvaldo had never met. These are papers initiating divorce proceedings and demanding a full financial accounting of our business partnership, I announced matter-of-factly. Given that approximately 40% of our income over the past 30 years has been diverted without my knowledge or consent, I'm seeking both criminal charges for embezzlement and civil remedies for recovery of stolen assets. Osvaldo's face went from gray to green. Madalena, please, we can work this out between us. There's no need to involve lawyers and courts. Oh, but there is, I replied with a smile that felt foreign on my face. You see, I've also been in contact with some of our business associates and social acquaintances. There's been considerable concern about your recent erratic behavior. Several people have suggested that you might be experiencing some form of mental breakdown. The trap I had been laying for weeks was now fully revealed by establishing a narrative of Osvaldo's declining mental state before revealing the truth about his double life. I had created a situation where any attempts he made to control the story would be viewed as further evidence of instability. In fact, I continued, I think everyone in our community is going to be very sympathetic to my situation. A devoted wife who discovered her husband's 30-year deception through extraordinary circumstances, dealing with both the emotional betrayal and the financial theft, while trying to help her husband through what appears to be a complete psychological collapse. Geronimo looked at me with something that might have been admiration. You planned all of this. I planned to reveal the truth in a way that would ensure justice for everyone who had been harmed by these decades of deception. I corrected. Your mother deserved to have her relationship acknowledged. You and Eduarda deserved to know your father and your sister. Beatrice deserved to know her siblings. And I deserved to know that my life partner wasn't stealing from me to support a secret family. The evening ended with Osvaldo leaving our house for what we all knew would be the last time as its owner. Beatrice, Geronimo, and Eduarda stayed longer, trying to process the new relationships and betrayals that had been revealed, beginning the complicated work of figuring out how to be siblings under these extraordinary circumstances. As I cleaned up the dinner dishes later that night, alone in the house I had shared with Osvaldo for 45 years, I felt something I hadn't expected. Peace. The memories from Cordelia's objects no longer felt like invasive intrusions, but like gifts from a woman who had wanted the truth to be known. Chapter 7. The legal proceedings that followed moved with surprising speed, partly because Osvaldo's guilt was so thoroughly documented, and partly because his attempts to defend himself only made him appear more unstable to everyone involved. The narrative I had carefully constructed about his mental decline provided the perfect framework for understanding his bizarre decision to maintain two families for 3 decades. Within a month, I had obtained a restraining order preventing him from accessing our business accounts. The forensic accounting I had demanded revealed even more extensive financial deception than I had initially discovered. The total amount he had diverted over the years was staggering, nearly 2 million reais that should have been building our shared retirement, but had instead funded his parallel life with Cordelia and their children. But the financial recovery was only one aspect of the justice I was pursuing. The social consequences were equally important to me. In a community like Araraquara, where reputation and respectability matter enormously, Osvaldo's exposure as a man who had maintained a decades-long deception destroyed his standing completely. The stories spread through our social circles with the intensity that only truly shocking scandals can achieve. The church ladies' auxiliary buzzed with speculation about how I had discovered the truth through what they whispered about as either divine intervention or supernatural gifts. Our business clients were fascinated by the tale of the devoted wife who had uncovered her husband's betrayal through mysterious memory episodes. It's like something from a television novella, Maria Santos told me during one of our coffee meetings, her eyes bright with the thrill of being close to such dramatic events. But with you as the heroine instead of the victim, how did you find the strength to plan such a perfect response? 30 years of partnership in business taught me the value of careful planning and documentation. I replied truthfully, when someone steals from you, whether it's money or trust, you need evidence to prove it. Meanwhile, my relationship with Beatrice, Geronimo, and Eduarda was evolving in ways none of us had anticipated. The shared trauma of discovering Osvaldo's deception had bonded us together. But we were all still processing the complex emotions of suddenly having family relationships that had been hidden from us. Beatrice struggled the most with anger, her father, feeling that his betrayal had somehow tainted her entire childhood and their relationship. How many times did he lie directly to my